Hi everyone, okay, and welcome to our webinar. Thank you for joining us, taking your time out to join us tonight. I know some of you are also in a different location in the world, so it'll be like 2 a.m. in Atlanta or something. Okay, so just going through the webinar topics today. So Joshua will talk about how to shoot the best wildlife photography as one of the topics. He'll also share the importance of color calibration and color accuracy, soft proofing for print. Joshua has also received a large amount of topics some viewers would like to discuss about, such as animal photography, specifically birds in flight, some camera settings, and landscape photography. He will try to cover as much as he can in this short 1 hour time frame. But we'll also have a 10-minute Q&A session for you to ask any questions as well. But feel free to ask any questions throughout the webinar and we'll try to get back to you at the end of this session, or we can answer the questions after the webinar as well. Now, a little bit about Joshua. He's a fully accredited Master of Photography and a member of the Australian Institute of Professional Photographers. Plus, he is also our BenQ ambassador. Now, Joshua is a multi-award-winning Australian photographer who has been devoted to landscape, nature, and wildlife photography. He has also won countless awards for his photography. His work has also been exhibited at international shows and expos across the USA and Europe, including Photokina in Germany and PhotoPlus in New York. Now over to Joshua.
Thanks very much, Grace. Hi, everybody. Thanks so much for coming along. Anytime there's an opportunity to talk about photography, I'm going to grab it, especially if it's wildlife photography, which I'm really passionate about. Before I kick off, I just want to thank BenQ. I want to thank Grace and Dan for all the effort they've done in putting the webinar on for tonight. As I said, anytime I get a chance to talk about photography with people who are passionate, it's a huge thing for me, and I really enjoy it. There's a lot I want to get through tonight. There's a lot I want to cover, and I'm going to try and get through as much of it as I can. I will take questions as we go. If you've got a question, please try and pop it into the Q&A, and I'll try and address it as we go along. And as Grace said, we're also going to have a Q&A session at the end as well. So hopefully there'll be an opportunity for me to answer any questions you might have. I'll do my best. Let's kick off with just talking about wildlife photography and what actually makes a great wildlife photograph. And I'm going to share a bunch of photographs and talk about them. I'll talk about the stories behind them, why I think they're successful photographs, and why some of them perhaps didn't work so well as well, and what tools and techniques I use when I'm in the field to make photographs. And I think it's really important to understand what makes a great photograph. You need three things, in my opinion. You need great light, that's kind of a given. You need great subject, and you need great composition. And 2 out of those 3 isn't really enough. You really need to bring all 3 together to get a great photograph. Now, when it comes to wildlife photography, in many ways, it's a little bit harder than landscape, because not only do you need a great subject, but the subject actually needs to be doing something interesting, because the world doesn't need another head and shoulders shot of a polar bear or a lion if we're trying to create something that's an emotional image, or is going to kickstart an emotional response in the viewer. So that's actually very hard to do, is to get all these things to come together: great light, great subject, great composition, and to get the subject doing something interesting. It's very, very difficult. So the way I like to look at it, and what I look for when I'm in the field, is what I call the 3 Fs. So that is, if I'm looking at wildlife, I'm looking at feeding, fighting, or fornicating, okay? So those 3 things are a great way to start to say, and I'm going to start a screen share here with some images, and hopefully you can all see these. I'm just going to jump up with start with an image of a polar bear that's feeding on a seal carcass. It's an image I shot back in 2013, so quite some time ago now, of a polar bear feeding. And it's an image I made. It was a very simple image to make, actually. It was made from a ship. We were slowly approaching the polar bear. This is up in the Arctic at about 81 degrees north. And I realized as we were approaching on the ship that there was a fantastic opportunity here, because the polar bear was feeding, so it was going to be doing something interesting. But what I also realized as we got closer was that I was too high up. So the ship was giving me a higher point of view than I wanted. And there was no intimacy between myself and the subject. And when it comes to wildlife, you really need to have intimacy between you and the subject. It's the same as if I'm doing portraiture with, shooting people. You need to have that eye-to-eye contact. If we shoot top down on our subject, we become a voyeur as the viewer. And as a result of that, there's a disconnect between the viewer and the subject. So we want to try and get rid of that in wildlife photography. And one of the ways to do that is to be at eye level or lower with your subject. So as we were approaching this polar bear on the ship, what I did was I ran downstairs to my cabin. I opened the porthole, I pushed my lens out the porthole, and I made the image. And just by running downstairs to my cabin, I was able to take an interesting image, because a polar bear's feeding is always interesting, but I was able to add a level of intimacy by being at eye level with the subject. Something to always keep in mind when you're photographing wildlife. I personally spend most of my time on the ground. I spend a huge amount of time lying in the snow, lying in the grass, being on the ground as low as I possibly can so that I can have that level of intimacy. And I think the smaller the subject, the more important it actually is. So with something like penguins, for example, that are quite small, it's even more important to be down low. So this is the first of what I call the 3 Fs, feeding. Then if we go to fighting, fighting is also very interesting when it comes to wildlife. And here we have a couple of Arctic foxes that I photographed. I think this might have been back in 2016 or 2015, somewhere around there when I was doing my project on the Arctic fox. This was with a 600mm lens. And what's interesting here is that this situation is obviously very dynamic. It's a situation that lasts only a split second or two when the foxes are fighting and carrying on like this in front of the camera. And it creates a very interesting image. There's a lot of action here. There's a lot of emotion and there's a lot of drama. So anytime you can get wildlife fighting, you're going to create an interesting image. And it doesn't have to be something as exotic as an Arctic fox, for example. It can be something far more simple, like birds in your backyard that might be fighting over birdseed. The moment something like that happens, it's time to really go very, very hard on shooting to try and capture it. A question that just popped up in chat, was this 600mm on a full frame? Yes, it was. This was no teleconverter. It was shot from a snow blind. So I actually dug a hole in the snow. What I found was photographing foxes that I was too big and as a person, and I was quite intimidating to them because an Arctic fox is small. It's not much larger than a house cat. And so as a human being, I'm quite big and intimidating. But if I dig a hole in the snow and I'll jump in it up to my neck, all the fox could see was my head and the camera. And suddenly I was far less intimidating to them and they would come much closer. So as I was working on this project, I started with 600mm lens, and by the end of the project, I was shooting foxes with a 24 to 70mm lens because they were comfortable with me in the hole and they would come quite close. So quite often that's how it can go. And then the third F, as I said, there's 3 Fs: feeding, fighting, and fornicating. Anytime you can capture that, you're also going to create something that's very, very interesting and unique. I think any interaction, in fact, you can have between two animals of the same species or not, so hunting behavior is included in this, you're going to have an opportunity to create very dramatic images. And when the animals aren't doing anything interesting, it really becomes about waiting. So a lot of wildlife photography is patience. It's waiting around in the field for something to happen, for the wildlife to either show itself or to do something that's interesting, that makes it worthwhile taking a photograph. So a lot of the time I liken wildlife photography to international long haul plane travel, right? So it's 20 hours of boredom sitting on a plane, but then it's 5 seconds of sheer terror at landing. And wildlife photography is a little bit like that. It's a lot of waiting around for the opportunity to shoot as many images as you can when the action happens in front of the camera. So there are times I've spent well over a week sitting in a hide waiting for a species of animal to come out for the opportunity to photograph it. Sometimes it happens and sometimes, unfortunately, it doesn't. I want to shift gears a little bit before I show any more images, any more wildlife images, and talk about something that I think is really fundamental, that it can actually help everyone improve their wildlife photography and doesn't cost you any money. Because pretty much everybody is out there trying to shill you something, the next gadget to improve your photography. what you can do to improve your photography exponentially is to actually learn the tool that you own already. And what I mean by that is, if someone hands me my camera, and I'm currently shooting with a Canon EOS 1DX Mark III, before that I was shooting with the Mark II and the Mark I, I can set the ISO on that camera, I can set an f-stop, I can set a shutter speed, and I can do it all blindfolded without thinking, because I've been using that camera so much that the controls are muscle memory for me. And that is extremely important. So just think about that for a moment. How many of you could do that? If I handed you your camera and blindfolded you, could set ISO 800, 1/1600th of a second at f5.6 without thinking about it. And when you can do that, when you achieve the ability to do that, when you've learned the tool enough that the controls become muscle memory, something very interesting happens. Your brain, and I've said this before in other webinars I've given, but it's very important, so I'll say it again. Your brain becomes freed up from being a technician to being an artist. And you no longer have to focus or think about what f-stop or what shutter speed should I be at, or am I at the right ISO, or am I exposing correctly? Instead, you can think about composition, and you can be ready for when the animal does something interesting. So, people often say to me, should I buy this new camera? And the camera manufacturers won't love me for this, but the answer is almost universally no. And same goes, do I buy this new lens because it might be a little bit sharper than the lens I've currently got? The answer is no. I guarantee you that the tools you've got are probably more than good enough to do the job. There's very rare situations now where a camera upgrade for me actually brings me something new that I didn't have beforehand. Almost universally now, it's got to do with me on the end of the camera and not the tool itself. So I say to people when I come on their workshops with me, quite often people are coming with the latest cameras. How long have you had this camera? And sometimes it's as little as a few days. You cannot be expected to get a great photograph with a camera you just bought, because your brain hasn't yet learned all of the controls by muscle memory. And this is something I've learned by observation over a number of years, watching people on workshops and expeditions, whereby I see people fumbling with their camera when the action is actually happening right now. And as a result of that, they're missing photographs. So the first thing I go over to them and do is help them quickly set their camera. And then I say, forget the camera controls now, focus on what's in front of you, focus on the wildlife and capturing what's going on. That's one of the reasons that when I'm photographing wildlife, I'm doing it almost exclusively in manual. So the reason for that is I like to walk outside, look at the light and say, okay, it's a 500th of a second at f5.6 at ISO 400. And usually I can be within half a stop to a stop, which means I just need to shoot one image, adjust the camera accordingly to make sure the histogram is correct. And then if the light doesn't change, I don't need to change my my exposure again. And I can focus completely on composition and watching the wildlife. So that's really, really important. And that's the best advice I can give anyone on how to improve your wildlife photography. Kind of just learn to use the tool you've got until it becomes muscle memory. And it's just practice. The more you do it, the better you get at it. And the more time you spend with your camera, the better you'll get at it. And it doesn't matter if it's just on birds in your backyard by throwing out a bit of bird seed, so you've got a moving subject to photograph. That's perfect to learn. When I was learning birds in flight, and I was extremely frustrated because I couldn't seem to get anything sharp. But the more I did it, the better I got at it. And I would just drive down to the beach and literally photograph seagulls by throwing out chips until I learned what worked and what didn't. Nowadays, we're blessed in that the tools are so good, especially now with this new eye tracking that's appearing in these mirrorless cameras and animal tracking, that it's getting easier and easier all the time. But the fundamental skills are still important to have. So I think, when it comes to knowing your camera and not being a prisoner to your camera, not standing there scratching your head while you're making control changes while the action's happening. That's the key. That's the key element to being able to take better wildlife photographs. So keep all of that in mind. As I said, light subject composition, but with the subject doing something interesting, and then your brain being freed up to be artistic. And what happens is, once you get all that technological stuff of the camera out of your brain and you're working on muscle memory, you can really start to think about where you position the subject in the frame. So if we look at this photograph as an example, I made a very conscious decision here to tilt the camera slightly. because I wanted to add some drama to the photograph. So I tilted the camera, and I knew that by tilting the camera, that little bit of horizon that was showing in the photograph would add some drama. It's more interesting than just a flat horizontal landscape. And you can break the rules like this as long as you understand the rules and when to break them. I think that's also very important. It's like placing the subject in the dead center of frame. There is a time and a place that it's okay to do that, and there's a time and a place that it doesn't work. There's a question that's just popped up in chat that I think is a very interesting one. And I'll just address it now here for the moment. Would you over or underexpose or use a custom white balance or an 18% gray card? Okay, this is how I do it. If I'm shooting in a snowy environment, so actually I'll back up from that. If understanding the camera's meter, that it is how it reads light, the sensor, it reads the scene in front of it as 18% gray. So what that means is if you point the camera at a snowy scene that's predominantly all white, the camera is going to underexpose it to try and send it gray. So you have to compensate for that. Now, you can do that a number of different ways. You can, if you're shooting in aperture priority or shutter priority, you can add some exposure compensation, 1.5 to 2 stops. If you're shooting in manual like me, then you can just compensate for it when you in your initial settings and shoot a histogram, shoot an image, check the histogram, see if it's where you want it to be, and you're good to go. Or another technique you can use is you can actually set your spot meter to read off the snow and set it to +1.5 or +2 stops. That will also give you the same result. So there's a number of different ways you can do that. And then when it comes to the actual white balance, in wildlife photography, what we're looking for ultimately is what's called pleasing white balance, not necessarily accurate white balance. So, you know, it doesn't matter. I'm not shooting a can of Koloff or a commercial where I have to match that exact shade of red. I'm looking for something that's pleasing to the eye. So I'll shoot in auto white balance. I'm shooting in RAW all the time with auto white balance. And then I will make a slight adjustment to the white balance in post-production if I feel it's required. So generally with my Canon cameras, I'm finding that they shoot pretty close to where I end up. It's very rare for me to have to move my white balance very much too far to the left or too far to the right in post-production. But by doing auto white balance in the field, I have the benefit of being able to set it later. So I think that's the way to go. Let's shift gears. I'm going to just bear with me 1 second. I'm just going to move a couple of windows out of the way. What I want to do is I want to go to some birds in flight, because there was a lot of questions about how to photograph birds in flight, and it's worth taking a moment to talk about them. So this is an Atlantic puffin. It's one of the few puffin species. It's also one of the fastest birds in flight that I think I've ever tried to photograph. They are like bullets. They're extremely quick and makes them extremely difficult to photograph. In this particular example, even more so because you've got a dark bird with a dark back on a dark background, which makes it very hard for the autofocus system. So the first thing I think you need to address when it comes to birds in flight is you need to know your subject. And this applies to any wildlife that you photograph. So before I go out and do a project in the field, whether it's on Arctic fox, Pallas cat, polar bears, or any of the others that I've done, I read everything I can about that subject. I read about its behavior. I read about where it might be found. I read about what it likes to eat, when it breeds, where it hangs out. All this sort of information can hugely help you once you're in the field, because the more you know about your subject, the more you can predict its movement and know what it's going to do next. Now, puffins are a great example. So this was photographed on the top of a cliff looking down over the ocean. So the dark background is the dark ocean in the background that's out of focus. And puffins, when they're coming into land, come in from the ocean at a huge rate of speed. And then just before they hit the cliff, they throw their wings out to slow them down, and they tip their head up. And if you know that, then you know that that's the moment that you can try, you've got a chance to capture them. So that's what I did in this instance. I waited for evening light. You can see this beautiful evening cross light here across the back of the puffin and across its face. And then I waited for that moment when the puffin started to slow down. So I would track the bird through the camera, as it's coming into the cliff. And I don't start to photograph. I'm just trying to keep it in the frame. And then as it starts to slow, I'll start to photograph on high-speed motor drive. And I'll probably end up shooting 50, 60 images of this particular bird in order to get the one that's actually good. It's very much a numbers game with birds in flight. And part of that is to do with wing position. So to get the ideal wing position, you just have to shoot a lot of frames, and then you can pick the one out of all those frames that really, really works. The question's been asked, why not expose on the animal with spot meter? You can do that, but it can be very difficult to keep the spot meter on a bird that's moving full speed. With the long lens, like in this case, I think this was a 600mm lens. It's very, very difficult to keep a fast moving bird in flight, let alone to keep a single spot on the actual bird itself to meter off it. That's part of why some of these new cameras that are coming on the market now with animal eye focus are going to make this a lot easier, because traditionally this has been probably one of the hardest things to do. And certainly burst mode is the way to go. Standing on a cliff like this, photographing puffins over the course of an evening, I might shoot as many as 10,000 images. As I say, in many ways, it's a numbers game. And the more you shoot, the more chance you have of actually getting something good, because the bird is moving so fast. You just literally have to keep photographing it, and then you throw away the ones that are out of focus and try and get the ones that are in focus. Where do I set my focus point when I photograph the puffin? So typically, in my case, because I'm using the Canon camera, I am using what they call center point with surrounding assist points. So that is one focus point with the 4 or 8 surrounding assist points. And then I try and keep that on the bird as I go. Now, as you're learning this technique and starting to photograph birds in flight, I would start with more focus points than that to make your life easier. So the more focus points you have as the bird's moving around the frame, the easier it's going to be for the camera to maintain a lock in focus. The problem you're going to run into there is that you'll find a lot of images where the focus has been locked on the wing. And as a result of that, the head is not sharp. So if you're going to use a lot of focus points when you're photographing birds in flight, it's very important to stop down the lens a little bit so that you have enough depth of field between the tip of the wing and the head of the bird. Otherwise, you'll end up with a sharp wing and an out of focus head, which is far from ideal. You always want to try and have the eye sharp in wildlife photography. You can forgive a multitude of sins if the eye is sharp. So sometimes if I'm photographing in the field very fast birds and I'm having some trouble, I will do that. I'll go to more focus points and I will stop down the lens to get more depth of field. Ultimately, what I'm trying to achieve with birds in flight is I love to have a situation, let me see if I can find one here, where I have, that one maybe not so much, this one's a better example, I think. Yeah, where I have a tack sharp head on the bird, but just sometimes a little bit of blur in the wing, just to create a feeling of movement. Because still photography, being what it is, a still image, it's very difficult to convey movement. We don't have the benefit of video. So sometimes a little bit of motion blur in the wing can really help convey a sense of movement in the wildlife. And you can do this with panning, with slow shutter speed. And just, of course, realize that the slower you slow your shutter speed down, obviously the more out of focus frames you're going to get. So your ratio goes down, but you can create some really beautiful results by doing this. I don't know if I actually have, this one might be a good example. So here we have a good example of a puffin coming up from the ocean, head tack sharp, but the wings there's blur in the wings, so we get a strong sense of movement in the bird. So I think it's fun to experiment with that and try and convey movement in your image. Ultimately, what I'm trying to do when I'm photographing any wildlife is obviously I want to tell the story of the animal, but my ultimate goal is really to try and achieve an emotional response in the viewer. So I want them to feel something when they look at the photograph. And the more drama I can inject into the image, the more feeling, the more motion, the better the chance I have of doing that. Because otherwise, if I don't try and do that, what we end up with is quite a stale photograph that becomes quite uninteresting. And that's not a lot of fun. I'll just see if I think I may have some eagles here. I do. Okay, so this is a golden eagle. It's one of the world's largest eagles that's photographed from a hide. in Finland in winter. As you can see, this eagle's coming into land at the moment. And this type of photograph is something that you can really only take if you're prepared for it. So you have to be ready, waiting for it, and you have to know the subject, know how the subject is going to come in and land. Is it going to come in a steep dive? Or is it going to come in low and then spread its wings out? What's it going to do? So the more information you can arm yourself with when you go out to photograph any species, the better your chances. I never go out just to photograph birds, for example. I go out to photograph a specific species because I find that I get a better result when I do that. I find otherwise it's a bit scattergun. I try and just, oh, look, there's a bird over there. I'll try and photograph that, you know, or there's another one over there. But no, that's not what I'm looking for. I'm going out today, and today the aim of my goal is to try and photograph sulfur-crested cockatoos. I've read about them. I know these are the kind of places they hang out. This is the sort of background I want, because in wildlife photography, background is as important as the subject. And it took me a long time to learn this. I would make a lot of photographs and I'd be very, very unhappy with them, you know, in the early days when I was shooting film and starting out. And finally it clicked for me that the background is more important almost than the subject. So a lot of the time when I'm looking for, when I'm setting myself up in the field, let me just find a wolf photograph as an example. Let's see here. This will do. Here we have a wolf in the forest in Finland. You can see that I've positioned myself in such a way that I have a very nice forest in the background that's soft and out of focus. And that comes through the ability of knowing how far away that background needs to be out of focus comes through experience. It varies depending on the telephoto lens that you're using and how close you are to your subject. But again, experience counts here. And the more you do this, the better you'll get at it. But when I'm in the field, when I get to a location, I'm going to start to photograph wildlife. I choose the spot I'm going to shoot from by the background. Now, I can't always do that. If I'm on a ship photographing polar bears, I have to live with the background I have. And the only way I can effectively control that is through my choice of lens and my depth of field. But they are critical considerations to wildlife photography. And you must actually take them into account. You don't want to have a background that competes with the subject or clutters the subject in any way, shape, or form. Photography very much is about simplicity, and strong images are almost always very, very simple images. So background for me is a critical part of the equation. The time of year that you choose to photograph obviously also makes a big difference, not just for birds, but for all wildlife. And depending on what you want to say about your subject, you know, you should choose an appropriate time of the year. For my Arctic fox project, and I'll just bring up some more images of those, you know, I chose to do the entire thing in the winter. And the reason for that was, there were several reasons for that. The first one was that I wanted to be able to show both the blue morph and the white morph Arctic fox against a snow background. So not a lot of people know, but they're actually two different morphs. It's the same species, but there's the blue morph and the white morph. So here we have the blue morph, which is actually a chocolate brown in winter, has a beautiful, thick, lustrous coat. And it's actually in hunting mode here. It was going for a ptarmigan, which is a small grouse type of bird that these foxes prey on. They actually missed. But you can see in this photograph, again, I've done a number of different things here. I've got a very clean background. That was a very deliberate choice where I chose to position myself. The second one was I used a fairly slow shutter speed, and I panned as the fox came out from behind the ice. So you can see there's blur in the fox's tail, there's blur in the snow, but it's pin sharp in the eye. Now, a few images either side of this, not so good. The position's not quite right. The focus is not quite so good. So again, it being a bit of a numbers game, excuse me, you need to shoot a lot. So I'm always shooting my wildlife in high speed mode. You know, my current camera shoots close enough to 20 frames a second. That's plenty for me in order to be able to capture these sort of images. And let me just see if I can show you the white morph as well. Let's see here. Okay. Yeah, this one will do. So here we have the white morph, which has a beautiful, obviously, white coat in the winter. This is probably the most sought after of the two species by photographers because it is white and does photograph so beautifully in the snow. But the blue morph is actually the rarer of the two, and in many ways makes a more interesting contrast to against the snow than the white one. Both of them are beautiful. They can both interbreed between the two of them, and they may have white or blue cubs as a result. One of the really interesting things about the Arctic fox, I don't want to spend too much time on them because we've got a lot to get through, but something very, very interesting is they are shot and hunted all across Iceland, where I made most of these photographs, except in the nature reserve in the far north, where they're protected. Now, what's interesting is that in the far north, they're having litters of roughly 4 to 6 pups in the nature reserve where they're protected. But in the rest of Iceland, where they're hunted, shot, and persecuted, they're having litters of 8 or more. So it's almost like the fox is adapted to the hunting that's going on and is self-regulating its own population by having more pups. Very, very interesting that this is going on. This will just give you a bit of an idea of some of the conditions I like to photograph in. Those of you who might know me already know that I'm a bad weather guy. I love bad weather and photographing in bad weather. The more blizzardy, the more snowy, the more rainy, the better. I think it creates really dramatic photographs and sets them apart from what everybody else is doing. So I'm always searching for bad weather. Whether I'm on a ship or photographing foxes or wolves, whatever it is, bad weather for me is gold. And I've been known to tell captains when I've chartered boats, head that way because there's a storm. Because it gives me more opportunity to create dramatic weather, to create dramatic images like this, where you've got flying snow sticking to the fur of the animal, and it's just very dramatic and emotional. And I think it's far more interesting than a blue sky day. Now, there's nothing wrong with blue sky photography. It's great for making postcards, but that's just personally for me, it's not what I'm interested in doing. I'm interested in creating dramatic photographs. Let's go into a project I did back in 2019 of the Pallas cat, and have a look at a few images from there and talk about a few other important considerations in wildlife photography. For those of you who don't know about the Pallas cat is a very, very rare cat. It lives in the high steppe region of Mongolia and China, Tibet. It's a very small cat, again, about the size of a domestic house cat. What is really unique about the Pallas cat is that it has a round pupil. So it's one of very few cats to do so. So you can distinguish it straight away from a domestic cat by that round pupil instead of an elliptical pupil. So I'm going to address this question that's just popped up in a moment, but I just want to talk a bit more about the Pallas cat. Before I went to photograph this, to try and find and photograph this cat, I did my research again. I read as much as I could and tried to learn as much as I could about this animal. But what I didn't know was how hard it was going to be to find and how hard it was going to be to photograph. So I spent 3 weeks in the field in winter in Mongolia, in temperatures between about -10 and -40, trying to find and photograph this cat. And over the period of 3 weeks, I think I found a total of 3 different cats, although I had 5 different photography sessions with cats. But I think there were 3 unique cats. I only had a couple of opportunities where the cats were out and away from these small rocky outcrops where I could photograph them. But they are an incredibly beautiful cat. Let me just jump to a different image, perhaps the one I'm best known for that did well in the recent Silver Lining Awards and Nature's Best, etc. Here you can see this is the Pallas cat in its winter coat, and it's a beautifully round cat. And who doesn't love a beautifully round cat? Now, what's interesting about this image is this was shot obviously with a long lens. You can tell by the shallow depth of field. But I was, again, at eye level, lying on the ground, resting my camera and lens on the snow. And when I started to photograph this cat, there was all kind of clutter in the way. There were reeds in the way. I didn't have a very good angle of view. I kept trying to maneuver myself I could get into a position where I had a clean line of sight through to the cat. And I was always looking at my background. So initially I had a quite untidy background. I had some rocks and things like that in the background that just were detracting from the image. So I keep maneuvering myself until I find the background that I like. And I don't stop until I get that background that I like, because it's critical to the final image. And then I was able to find a spot where I could peek the lens through the reeds and get a clear view of the cat. Now, here's a really cool technique you can use if you've got a long lens with wildlife. And you can do it when you're practicing in a zoo too. If you take a long lens, say 300, 400, 500, or 600 millimeter, and you open it up as wide as it'll go, so somewhere between f2.8 and f4, and you push it hard up against the bars at the zoo, do you know what happens? All the bars go so out of focus, they become invisible. And you can this way, you can photograph an animal in the zoo when you're practicing without that horrible bars in the way. And the same applies, and this is a technique I used here for this photograph. There were reeds in front of my lens, and yes, if I just hit the autofocus, the reeds would snap into focus. But if I turn the lens to focus on the cat and ignore the reeds are close enough to the lens that they're so far out of focus now that they're invisible to the viewer. So it's a really cool technique just to keep in mind if you're struggling with something in front of you, just keep in mind, try moving really close to it and throwing it so far out of focus that it's no longer an issue. Okay, how do I deal with ISO in bad weather? And how high do I feel comfortable shooting? So the answer to that is I will go as high as I need to get the shutter speed that I want. I'm very, very comfortable shooting at ISO 3200, 6400 on my cameras without hesitation. I believe nowadays that with the noise reduction software that is out there, you can very, very easily clean up those images to look as good as what we would get from ISO 200 just a few years ago. So I don't worry about ISO too much. I think set the ISO you need to get the shutter speed that you want. And then if you need to apply some noise reduction in post-production, then go right ahead and do so. There's so many good tools out there now for removing noise from photographs, and they're so powerful. This is an ISO 800 image to give you some idea. There's zero noise in it. There's zero noise reduction been applied to it in post-production. In fact, I don't even apply any noise reduction to my images until I get to about ISO 3200. And part of the reason I can get away with that is because I make sure my exposure is correct in the field. So if you understand how a digital sensor works, then you know that if you underexpose an image, then as you fix it in post-production, by adding exposure, you're actually amplifying the noise. So if you can do it the other way and expose to the right and then move the image more underexposed in post, you're actually going to remove noise. So that's a cool thing to keep in mind too. It's very important to try and get your exposure right in the field. What do I think of bird photos with a plain blue sky background? I think they can be very pretty. I've got hundreds of Puffin images against a blue sky background. They're not images that I'm necessarily going to do much with in terms of view of marketing, but I still think they can be very, very beautiful, especially if it's about the species of bird. But at the end of the day, the sky is just the background. So, if it's a beautiful species of bird, it's great posture, great gesture in the bird, and it's doing something interesting in good light. Who cares if it's a blue sky background? It doesn't matter. So don't let that stop you. What was my shutter speed for that last image in the snow? I'm going to assume that was the one with the fox that was leaping out after the ptarmigan, because that was a slow shutter speed image, and that was about 2/50th of a second. So 2/50th of a second is not enough usually for birds. With birds, I'm probably going to be around 1,000th of a second or more, but with something like a mammal, I think you can be down around the 2/50th. Even slower than that, depending on how fast it's moving and what it's doing. Again, you need to experiment a little bit depending on the subject, speed, distance from camera, all that sort of thing as well. Okay, I'll just show a few more Pallas cat images because I think it's a species that's not seen very often. Let's just go to Backlight. Backlight, here we have a Pallas cat in Backlight. Backlight's actually my favorite type of light to work in. It's the most difficult to work in, but I think it's the most emotive and evocative. And when you're working in backlight with wildlife, it's all about rim light. So it becomes all about showing that outline of the cat, in this case, against that golden background. Now, on the day I made this image, I had a guide when I was in Mongolia who basically helped me locate Pallas cat. He also was taking photographs, and he was photographing it from the other side, and he couldn't understand why I'd gone around to photograph it into the sun until I showed him the back of my camera. And then he got it, because again, you get the sense of the animal. You can see a little bit of its breath as well in the cold air. You get that beautiful rim light and that beautiful orange background. So whenever there's an opportunity to try and work in backlight, I will do so. Let me just grab another backlight image. It's one I'm quite well known for, that I shot of a polar bear up in the Arctic, that really, I think, illustrates the point really well of what can be achieved. So here we have a fairly young teenage polar bear that's just killed a bearded seal. It's sitting on the ice. This is winter in Svalbard. I think it was freezing. It was like minus 40 degrees. Sun was setting. I was in a group of about 5 photographers, and we went around deliberately for backlight, where we placed the sun behind the polar bear, and we get this fantastic rim light on the edge of the bear. We get beautiful oranges as a result. And you can create really dramatic photographs this way. It doesn't have to be a mammal. It works well with birds as well. It's hard to do with birds, but it can be done. So backlight, again, is something I really, really like to try and work in. In this case, do you focus on the rim hair of the animal? Yes and no. It depends a little bit. I try and focus on the eye of the animal at all time, if I can. But in situations like this, where it's too dark to really focus on the eye properly, I will focus on the rim light on the hair of the bear. But here's what's really, really important. When you get into this situation, doesn't matter the subject, you've got to seriously underexpose to avoid blowing out that rim light. Because if you blow out the rim light, all the little hairs on the animal, all that detail will be lost and you can't recover it. So the moment you move into a backlight situation, understand that you need to significantly underexpose the image to avoid blowing that out. It may be as much as 3, 4, or even 5 stops, depending on how strong the light is at a given case in time. So again, you're going to have to experiment. And when I'm photographing in this sort of situation, I will shoot an image and check it. I'll check the histogram. I'll zoom in and see, am I getting any blinkies on the rim light around the animal? And if I am, then I'll underexpose more, because that's really critical. If you lose that detail, it's gone forever and you can't get it back. So try not to do that. But backlight's fantastic to work in, because you can just create such wonderful images in backlight. I want to show a few more polar bear images. I've basically shown a lot of telephoto images so far, but there's also a time and a place for a lot of wide angle work with wildlife. This is quite a good example. I think it's a fairly simple image, just of a polar bear walking across sea ice. You know, I could have very easily shot this, zoomed right in on this with a 600mm lens and made it a tight shot, but I felt that the melt pools in the foreground really spoke about climate change. They spoke about the melting of the ice cap. They spoke about the environment the polar bear is living in, and I wanted to capture that. And this is one of the reasons that when I'm photographing wildlife in the field, I'm always doing it with 2 cameras. So one camera has a telephoto lens and one has something else on it, a wide angle or a shorter telephoto, but always something different. And I don't just change lenses in the field because it takes too long. With wildlife, the moment is often gone. By the time I can take the 600 off, put on another lens, the moment's gone. So I like to shoot with 2 cameras in the field. I'll just leave the other one sitting in the snow. I'm really bad at that. I don't look after my gear. For me, they're just tools of the trade. So I'm very much known to throw it in the snow and just leave it there until I need it. Do I use fill flash? No, I don't shoot with flash ever, actually. I tried it once with a wolverine. I waited 3 days in a hide for this wolverine to come, and it came, the flash went off, and it ran off into the forest. So I kind of learned my lesson the hard way with flash. There is a time and a place you can use it, but I personally don't use it. I made the comment about blinkies. Blinkies are just on the back of your camera. When you blow out the highlights, if you have your camera set correctly, it will show you that those highlights are blown out by blinking at you. So that's a technical term, the blinky. Would I underexpose on a bird with white feathers or overexpose? I would. It depends a little bit on the background. So generally speaking, if you're metering off a white bird, and you're actually taking your meter reading off the bird itself, you're going to want to overexpose, because otherwise the camera is going to try and send the bird gray. But keep in mind that it is background dependent too. So if the bird's very small in the frame and the rest of the frame is basically a blue sky, then overexposing is just going to send that blue sky to white. So just be a little bit careful there. This is another example of a backlight photograph. And I wanted to show this one because this is a good example of how you can use backlight to clean up a messy background. So here we have a polar bear on rocks, on land. So typically polar bears don't photograph very well on rocks. They just photograph much better on ice. But I was able to have the Zodiac driver position the Zodiac in such a way that the sun was directly behind the bear. And by exposing for the extreme rim light on the bear, it threw everything else black. So all that untidy background just got thrown black, and suddenly I had a nice clean background and a very evocative image. So that's another good example of when you can use backlight. I just want to show a few more examples of wide angle wildlife photography because I think they're really, really important. Here's another one. You know, it's just a polar bear in a winter landscape, but it gives a great sense of the environment in which the animal lives. So we don't always want to be shooting telephoto. That's why I'll shoot with 2 cameras and 2 lenses so that I can have a variety of photographs. In landscape photography, one of the cardinal sins I would see on workshops with people is they set themselves up. Okay, we go to a waterfall, they set themselves up, they make a composition that they're happy with, and then they retake that photograph again and again and again. And they might vary the shutter speed, they might use some ND filters, whatever. You've got to keep changing it up all the time in landscape and wildlife. So the second I start thinking to myself, okay, I've got to do something different, time to change cameras, time to do something a little bit different to create something more interesting. Time is absolutely flying for me, guys. I'm told it's already 7:20 and I've got so much more I want to talk to you about. I want to just stress for a moment, shift gears completely. While I've got time, I want to shift to, because I said to you before that, you know, one of the best things that you can do for your wildlife photography is not buy a new camera and learn the tool that you already have until it's muscle memory. And I really believe in that. But I also believe very much that you need to have the best monitor that you can. So if you need to make an investment somewhere in your photography, ensure that you're operating with a high quality monitor. So what do I mean? I mean, something that's capable of displaying a wide color gamut. Okay, so at the moment, the color gamut of the web, that is the palette of colors that are displayed across the internet, is what's known as sRGB. It's a very small color, a very small amount of color, a very small color space. But monitors are capable of displaying much greater color. So you really want to monitor that's capable of displaying Adobe RGB, which is a much larger color space. Once you've got that, it's very important that you calibrate that monitor to a known standard. And there is a known standard that you can work to. I haven't got time to go into the technicalities of it now, but in essence, it's D6500 degrees Kelvin with a gamma of 2.2. And you can look that up on YouTube, what all that means. But in essence, what it's doing is it's ensuring that the color that you're displaying on your screen is going to match the color that was originally in the file, so that when you go to make a print, you also get a matching print at the end of the day. So basically you're creating a known standard, and you're doing it at the starting point. So if you don't operate on a color calibrated monitor, you're going to have trouble all the way down the line if you start making prints, sending images to web or to marketing or to licensing photographs, anything like that. So it's a critical step. It's a critical piece of equipment that, you know, we really shouldn't skimp on. The monitor, I think, is as important as the camera these days. So just a little bit of advice on monitors, because we had that in the our itinerary of things we were going to cover today. We also had in there soft proofing. And I really would love to talk to you all more about soft proofing and what it means and how to make prints that perfectly match your screen every time. What I will say for now is on soft proofing is if you are operating on a color calibrated monitor, okay, so what I was just talking about, and if you have a good profile for your printer and paper, you'll get good screen to print matches. I have done some videos on soft proofing. If you jump over to my YouTube channel, and look up soft proofing, you'll find, I think it's about a 1 hour video on soft proofing, and you can look that up as well. I want to address a question that's been sitting here in front of me for a little while, and then I want to turn it over to all of you guys for questions. The question is, how do I, in regards to networking in wildlife photography, how do you network to your photography tours overseas? How are you able to have people assist with you on photography tours? Okay, let me address the first part of that. Before I take anybody anywhere, on any trip, doesn't matter whether it's around the corner from home or to the Arctic or Antarctic, I go there myself and I do my research. I want to know where is the right time to be, where am I most likely to find the right species, and so because it becomes my job. You know, if I'm in the field doing a project on my own, if I'm wasting my time, it doesn't matter. But the second I've got clients with me in the field, they're relying on me to get them to the right place at the right time to get the best possible photograph. Therefore, I see it as my responsibility to know what I'm going into. So emperor penguins is a great example. So the first time I went down to photograph emperor penguins in Antarctica, I went on my own. And I invested in myself. I spent a huge amount of money, tens of thousands of dollars, and I went down there and I found the place to go, how to get there, what was the best time of day to go out to the colony, where the colony was located, so that I had all that information when I took clients that they could then, and then as a result of that, they will then rely on me on future trips. They know that I'm going to deliver a good result. So I think it comes back down to research again. Know the place that you're going to, or if you're going with someone like myself, make sure they know the place they're going to, and make sure that they've been there and done their research. Could I explain a little about what I'm looking for when checking the histogram? Yes, good question, Hannah. What I'm looking for is that the histogram should be biased towards the right-hand side. So I don't want it pushed hard up against the right-hand side because that will be clipped and I'll lose highlight detail. But I do want to have it biased towards the right-hand side. So if we shoot, now, it doesn't matter how high a given tone is. So a histogram is just a visual representation of the tones in a photograph. It can show you from 0 black to 255 white and everything in between. And you might have a huge spike of a certain tone. That's fine. It doesn't matter. It can spike as high as it likes. But what's critical is it's not pushed hard to the right so that it becomes clipped and I'm losing information. So what I'm looking for when I'm looking at my camera, at the back of my camera. And by the way, when I am looking at the back of my camera, I'm only ever looking at the histogram. I'm not looking at the JPEG image. I already know what the composition is because I framed it in my head. So I don't need to look at that. I'm looking at the histogram. I want to see that it's biased to the right-hand side, not underexposed and not overexposed. What are my experience with teleconverters? Hit and miss is my initial response to that. In DSLR terms, teleconverters can be problematic. I have lost a lot of images as a result of teleconverters, but I've also made images I would not have otherwise got. In mirrorless, it's a little bit different. If you're shooting a mirrorless system with teleconverters, I think you have more leeway in my experience. It just has to do with the way the optics work. So a teleconverter is something I keep in my pocket. I will use it, but I will try to avoid using it if I can. One of the great things about having more megapixels, of course, is you can crop. So if you are shooting a high megapixel camera, my inclination would be to not use a teleconverter and crop, because most of the time, 20 megapixels is 10 times more than we need anyway. Excuse me. My experience with medium format wildlife photography. I have tried medium format for both landscape and wildlife. I personally didn't like it, but I understand why people want to use it. And why they get enjoyment from the system. So I think, certainly for high-speed wildlife, medium format's problematic because you just don't get the autofocus and you just don't get the burst modes that you get in DSLRs. So I think it's a question of the right tool for the right job. Use an I1 or a spider for calibration. Yes, any colorimeter will be fine for calibration. You don't need to go and buy, spend $1,000 or more on a spectrophotometer. You can use a colorimeter from Spider or X-Rite and for a couple of $100 and get a great result for sure. Circular polarizers. I almost never use a polarizer, especially in the Arctic and Antarctic. I find that they very easily artificially darken the corners to an unnatural state. So my preference is not to use a polarizer unless I'm in a situation where I'm trying to remove the sheen from water. A polarizer will do a fantastic job of that. Or sometimes I'll use it as sort of an ND filter if I'm shooting waterfalls and things like that. What are my essential lenses at a minimum? For wildlife, it's subject dependent. So if I'm going out to photograph very shy subjects like Pallas cat, 600 millimeters is my go-to lens. Or if I'm photographing birds, 600 millimeter lenses. I don't think you can ever have too much lenses with birds. You know, it's always easy to be further away than it is to be too close. With some of the other species, I found I prefer 400 millimeters. So polar bears, you know, I will use my 400 2.8 rather than my 600 f4 a lot. Same for Arctic foxes. It really depends on the subject, the size of the subject, and how close I think I'm going to be able to get to the subject as well. So I take all those things into consideration when I'm thinking about what lenses I might take. But when I am packing for a trip, I like to say to people, you know, okay, you're into photography, you love it, that's fantastic. You're coming with me to photograph polar bears in the Arctic, brilliant. What lenses do you have? And I'll say, you know, they'll say, what should I bring? I'll say, well, what lenses do you have? And I'll say, well, I've got a 16-35, I've got a 24-70, I've got a 70-200, and I've got a 300 2.8 and a teleconverter. Fantastic, bring it all. Bring everything you own in terms of lenses when you're going away in terms of travel photography, because it's better to have it and not need it than to need it and not have it. And as I like to say to people, you know, you paid $10,000, $15,000 for that lens. You know, it's no good having it sitting on your study desk at home when you need it here now in the Arctic to help photograph this polar bear. So I say bring everything. Typically on the sort of trips that I do, we're not doing much in the way of hiking. So travel across land carrying, it's not really that much of an issue. In fact, photographing from boats is what I call sip clip photography. It's a luxury. You know, you go outside on the boat, you make a few photographs, it's -10, you get cold, you go inside, you have a hot chocolate, put your gear down, warm up, and then you go outside again. It's not always difficult like that. You know, sometimes it is, you know, like when I'm out photographing Pallas cat on my own in Mongolia in winter and I'm exposed 8 to 10, 12 hours a day in -30 degrees. Yeah, it's tough. And I'm carrying my gear on my back. But these are sacrifices that I'm willing to make to get the photographs that I want to try and get. If I'm shooting up into the sky, correctly exposing the subject would blow out the sky. Is that acceptable? And how would I deal with that? It depends a little bit. If I am shooting up into the sky, typically it's going to be birds. And I don't mind if I'm blowing out the sky, as long as I'm not blowing out the bird. I think that's the critical element, because for me personally, when I look at my images on the computer, I find a bird against a white sky as interesting as a bird against a blue sky. So I don't worry too much about that. I think the subject is what's critical here. Don't blow out your subject. And, you know, even err on the side of caution, especially with feathers and wingtips and things like that. That's where you'll see a blown out area, and that's where you don't want to lose detail. What precautions would I take to protect camera and lens when shooting? This is a do as I say, not a do as I do, because I don't take any precautions, quite honestly. I'm known for literally throwing the camera in the snow and picking it up at the end of the day, and it'll be a block of ice. The cameras that I'm shooting, these Canon 1DX Mark IIIs, they're built like trucks, and they can take it. I've had them in -50 degrees where they're so frozen that the dials are frozen in place, because what happens is your hand is warm, and so as the ice and snow falls on the lens, on the camera, it melts and then freezes, and it will freeze buttons in place, and it will freeze dials in place. And I've had it where the camera, literally the only thing working anymore is the shutter and the focus button, because my fingers are still on them. So I don't take any precautions. I consider them tools. My advice though to people is, unless you are shooting equivalent equipment, take precautions. Use rain covers, use some sort of protection for your equipment, because, you know, yes, you might have insurance on it. Maybe the insurance will pay out, maybe it won't, I don't know. But, you know, again, you're at the other side of the world. You don't want to have a camera malfunction because you didn't bother to protect your equipment. So it's, as I say, it's a do as I say, not a do as I do. Again, having multiple cameras in this area is incredibly important, because if I've got, you know, one camera goes down, doesn't really matter. I've got another one that I can use. I will say that if you are planning a trip to the extreme cold, let's say something where you might encounter minus 20 Celsius and below, be aware that mirrorless cameras can be problematic. So battery life in mirrorless cameras is typically not as good because the batteries are quite small by comparison, and they get used up a lot much faster because of the EVF, or the electronic viewfinder, eating up the battery. And if you get really cold, minus 30 and below, you might find the EVF actually starts to fail. So that's just something to be aware of if you are shooting mirrorless kit. You can, of course, keep it warm inside a jacket and things like that as well. Have I used extension tubes to get up close to animals? Yes, I have. Sometimes when I want to do detail, so if I want to do detail on a penguin's feet, I will use an extension tube. And what that does, for those of you who don't know, is you can put a small tube, it's hollow, there's no elements in it, between the lens and the camera, and that closes the close focusing distance and allows you to get much closer to the subject and still maintain focus. I don't do it very often, but very occasionally I will. We are actually completely out of time. I'm happy to stay on and take a few more questions and go through these questions. I really wanted to cover a whole bunch more tonight, but an hour is not that much time to have. Let me address a couple more of these questions, as long as you guys are happy to hang around. What gloves do I use in cold weather? I wish I had $1 for every time I had been asked that. I think I probably own 40 pairs of different gloves, and I have tried just about everything on the market, from your standard woolen mitten to the most expensive, elaborate battery heated type gloves. My experience has been that the best solution for me is to wear an inner glove on my left hand with a big down mitt. Okay, so I have no dexterity at all in my left hand then, but that is the hand that's supporting the lens. I don't need any dexterity, so that hand will stay warm. And then on my other hand, I will wear the same inner mitt that's very thin, from merino wool, and gives me a lot of dexterity. And then I'll have a mitt that has an open section, and I can tuck my 3 fingers, except my forefinger and thumb, into the mitt and throw a hand warmer in there. And then I just have these 2 fingers exposed to operate back button focus and the shutter speed. And that works for me. I still get really cold fingers, but that's the best solution I've been able to come up with. I've tried battery gloves. I own, I think, 3 pairs of them. They are warm, but I find that I lack enough manual dexterity. And I think, especially with some of these smaller mirrorless cameras, you might really struggle with the thicker gloves. Okay, so I read on your blog about carrying equipment and weight restrictions. Do I still find this occurs in places? It does. I'll say this, the more you fly, I fly a lot. Like in a normal year, non-COVID year, I do 70 flight segments a year. So I go around the world 8 times, and I'm up in the Arctic and bouncing back to Australia and down in Antarctica and bouncing back, and I'm off to all sorts of places. I travel 7 months of the year normally. So as a result of that, I've acquired quite a lot of flight status, which means that I get overlooked for a lot of my luggage. Mr. Holko, welcome back. You're a frequent flyer with us. It's not a problem. If you're flying only every now and again, it's much more likely to be a problem for you. And I would simply say that a smile goes a very long way with airport staff. Recognize that staff at the airport, they have a tough job. They're dealing with people on a daily basis who are rude to them all the time. So I find that I smile, I talk to them, I ask them about their day. I try and get them interested in what I'm doing. If they start getting inquisitive about the weight of my bag, yeah, I'm a photographer, I'm a wildlife photographer. Do you want to see some of my work? And I'll pull out my phone and I'll quickly start showing them images. And before you know it, they've completely forgotten about the weight of my bag and they're fully enthralled in what I'm showing them. And then they've got to hustle me along because the next person's behind me anyway. So I think a smile goes a long way when you're traveling internationally with gear. Let me address this question that's just come through. BenQ have basic PC and higher quality displays. Which is the minimum model that will give accurate colors for your work? Okay, so it's a very easy way to address this. BenQ make what they call a photography line of monitors. So any of those monitors will absolutely do the job. Now, you don't necessarily need the biggest and most expensive display. What you want is a monitor that can simply give you a large gamut of color. So Adobe RGB is typically what we're working in with monitors as photographers. And every one of the BenQ monitors in that range can do that. So you could pick any one of them to suit your budget. Resolution is not a necessity. You can simply buy the monitor that suits your budget and recognize that the resolution is not a limiting factor. You know, you can work on a 1024. I'd rather work on a 1024 by 768 monitor that gave me an Adobe RGB color gamut than I would work on a higher resolution monitor with a very small sRGB gamut. So you can choose based on your budget. And obviously, the more you spend, the bigger the display, the more resolution you get, but recognize that you're not necessarily getting an increase in color gamut. I'm going to just finish up with a couple more questions here because I really wanted to try and get through so much more. I had notes here on all these things I want to talk to you guys about. I might have to do another webinar at some point, just on some of the topics that I've literally touched on today. Let's have a look at this question here. With low light or night photography, would I use a light like a red light for capturing animal in these conditions? That reminds me of an experience I had in Tasmania trying to photograph little penguins on an island at night using red light. And it wasn't a good experience. I didn't like any of the images that I made. And what I found was it just was very unnatural to me, the finished result. Yes, I could dial out some of the red light to some extent in post-production, but the end result wasn't natural. So I've tried it. I don't like it. And again, that's a personal thing. It's a little bit like light painting. You know, if you go out and you paint the landscape at night with a torch to try and fill in detail, yes, it can be interesting, but it's not really something I'm into. I'm very much, and I guess this is a good way to sort of finish off, I'm very much an in-camera artist. So I believe in getting the shot in camera. I'm willing to put the hours in the field to get it in the camera. I don't want to have to create it in post-production. I'm not a computer guy in terms of, I don't want to be a Photoshop technician. You know, for me, I would, on average, I spend less than 5 minutes post-producing an image once I've got the raw file. And the reason for that is if I've decided to work on that particular one, it's probably already a great image. If it needs more than 5 minutes of my post-production time, it probably wasn't that great to begin with. You know, and that's just my style. I'm not saying it's right or wrong. It's just my take on how I go about photographing wildlife. I very much want people to look at my work. You know, if I bring up, let's just bring up an image of a wolf again, as an example. See, okay, this one's actually on the cover of my new book that's coming back from the printers tomorrow. I want people to know when they look at this image that this is how it was in nature. You know, I don't want them to think, oh, he photoshopped the grass in or he dropped the wolf in. You know, yes, it's all possible, but I don't want to be known for that, and I don't want to do that. I think as credibility is extremely important for me because I'm licensing a lot of my work to corporations that want to use it in annual reports. They want to use it in shareholder reports. It's going onto their websites. And therefore, credibility is extremely important, especially when some of these companies these days are using these images to green spray themselves. You know, oil companies especially buy polar bear images because they want to appear good for the environment. And I think it's important that people who look at my photographs know that this is how it was in nature. I don't hide the fact that, yes, there might have been 50 images either side of this particular one image where I didn't quite get it right. That's often the case. Knowing, being able to take a great photograph is one thing, but knowing how to edit it and pick that one photograph out of the 5,000 that you might have come home with from that day's shoot is also an extremely important skill. And that's perhaps something I can also talk about in another webinar as well. So look, thank you so much for joining me tonight for this opportunity to talk about wildlife photography. As I said, I wanted to get through as much as I possibly could tonight. An hour is not a lot of time. I literally could talk about this stuff all night. I have a lot more I'd love to share. If you'd like to hear more, please drop BenQ a note, say, yep, I want to hear more on this particular topic, and we will certainly try and address it. Last bit of advice for all of you, you know, there is wildlife around all of us. I've been locked up here in Victoria now since, what is it, March last year when I got back from Greenland. It's the most time I've spent in Australia in 10 years. I'm still photographing. You know, I'm photographing sulfur-crested cockatoos in my backyard. When it pours with rain the other day, I grabbed the camera. I went out to try and photograph some kangaroos in the rain. So get out there with your cameras, make some images and practice, because that's ultimately, you know, what helps you create better images. Thank you very, very much.
All right, thank you, Joshua. Time certainly did fly by and you went through really quickly and we couldn't really keep up as well. So that was really good and great to see everybody asking questions and you as well answering the questions as well as you go. We'll definitely pencil you in for like another webinar. So everybody keep posted. So we'll also, this webinar is actually also recorded as well. So whoever has registered or didn't get a chance to join, they'll also be sent the details and the links as well. So this will also be up on our YouTube. They can rewatch this as well. And we'll also link all the links on the email and through the video to your website, and everybody can find out more information as well on where to go.
Fantastic. Again, thanks very much to BenQ for the opportunity to put this on. You know, it's nowadays in the COVID world, it's the status quo, but it is fantastic to be able to bring, you know, any group of like-minded people together and share a passion.
Really great. Thanks so much, Josh. And just echoing, thank you to everyone for joining. If you look in the chat section, there's a few websites there already that you can click on, including the BenQ website and also Josh's website. So stick around and just grab those links before you go, because they won't be available to you afterwards. But we'll definitely get back to you with a follow-up email with the recording and all the other information.
Yes.
So we'll do a sign off now. Would you like me to sign off? Would you like to sign off, Grace? I haven't said too much for this webinar. I'm just been in the background, which is okay. So
Dan's been a great help.
So how about introduce yourself, Grace, for whoever's still here? Oh,
yes. Okay. So I'm Grace and I look after the marketing for our B2C side. So a lot of our monitors, photographer monitors, our projectors as well. And Dan here looks after our B2B side, which would you like to explain a little bit more?
No, that's okay. I can be a man of mystery for this one.
Yeah.
So thank you so much to everyone, and we will hopefully see you in the next webinar.
All right.
Bye.
Bye, guys.